It's a really great pleasure to be here. Thank you, Eric, for inviting me. I've heard great things about this meeting over the years, and sorry, I should stand near the microphone, although I'm loud. So I took the be controversial topic or charge to heart. I'm involved in lots of controversial things. People who know me know I'm, if anything, sort of drawn to controversy. I do think that a lot of the controversial topics I'm involved in are not going to be controversial within this room. You know, I think I have strong support for genetic modification of crops. I believe in vaccines. I think scientists should be involved in politics. I think there's a lot of things that I think this room would be all in favor of, and it's not really all that fun to talk about controversial things with people who agree with you. So I'm going to, I think, talk about something that may have some dissent in people in the room. And most of the time when I'm talking about controversial things, I'm talking about science publishing. But I'm actually not going to talk about science publishing today. A lot of people in the room have heard me talk about that before. But it's somewhat related. So how do I do this? OK. So first of all, another controversial thing I could have talked about was Comic Sans. I know all of you saw this article that was going around on the internet about how Comic Sans, the much derided Comic Sans, is actually really good for people with dyslexia. But Comic Sans is really, I still find it aesthetically impossible. So I'm actually using in my talk a different font that was designed for people with dyslexia. I have people in my family with dyslexia. This is called Open Dyslexia 3, and I kind of like the way it looks. So if you don't, sorry, then we've already had a controversy. Okay, so like many controversial things these days, it involves CRISPR a little bit, or starts with CRISPR. And I think we're all kind of sick of talking about CRISPR. Certainly at Berkeley, we're sick of talking about CRISPR as a controversy. We like talking about it as science. The various controversies around CRISPR pretty much always get reduced to this one thing of, you know, who owns CRISPR, right? That's the topic of the moment. Is it, you know, I'm not taking any sides. But the discussion usually boils down to, is CRISPR owned by Berkeley? Is it owned by the Broad? Is it owned by somebody else who we're not even fighting with in court? But actually, that's controversial. I know I could talk about that forever, but I really don't want to talk about it. What I really want to talk about is, why does anybody own CRISPR? And this is an issue that I've been interested in for a long time and have touched on in a lot of ways, but I think it doesn't get a lot of attention. And I also think it is kind of controversial in this room, and you'll see why when I get closer to the end. The reason anybody owns CRISPR is, I think, for many people will know, is because of these two fine gentlemen. Birch Bayh and Bob Dole, who were senators back in the 70s and 80s, who were concerned about the fact that a lot of government-funded science was not turning into products that were benefiting the population. And they felt that one of the problems was the way that intellectual property in government-funded inventions were being promulgated. That is, at the time, if you had a grant from the federal government, and it was complicated, but more or less, if you had a grant from the federal government and you invented something, it was owned by the federal government. And there were very complicated rules governing what would happen with those things and how they would be licensed. But it was true, and there were a lot of studies at the time showing that a lot of the things that were invented by NIH-funded research were not being used. Those patents weren't being used. They weren't getting out into the world. And so they created legislation called the Bayh-Dole Act, which I'm not going to get you to read here. This is just one clause from it. But I just want to summarize what the Bayh-Dole Act tried to do. Its goal was to promote the use and commercialization of federally sponsored inventions. Good thing to do. To promote collaboration between academia and industry, and do so in a way that did not encumber future research and discovery. And the way it chose to do it was to say that the actual institutions that were carrying out this research were going to be given patents in the right to patent the inventions that their people discovered. And the idea was that by giving, say, a university a patent in something that one of its faculty discovered, that the university would now have an incentive to go out and figure out how to get that work commercialized, maybe in a way that the federal government was unwilling or unable to do. They would find investors, they would find companies willing to do it, and that because they had a profit motive in doing so, because the money would ultimately come back to the university, that this would all of a sudden reach this glorious era where all these discoveries were coming out to the public. So what I really want to talk about today is does this work? Does this system that was created to try to get all these things out into the public work? And I'll give you a hint. No. But this is where the controversy is going to come in. I don't think so. And I want to sort of try to tell you why I think this. And I just want to say that I'm trying to be intentionally a little bit controversial with some of these things. There's not a lot of data to support a lot of the statements because people don't study this problem very carefully. There's a little bit out there, but it's not a very deeply investigated thing. When Bayh-Dole was up for renewal a couple of years ago, it sort of just crept under the radar screen. It was renewed without a lot of discussion or controversy. So most of what I'm going to present here are my ideas and my thoughts, not particularly the results of sort of deep research into the problem. I want to see that happen, but it hasn't happened yet. In some sense, it did work. Academic patents are way up. They're about 3 or 4 times as many per year granted now as there were when the act was initiated. This data from the Patent Office doesn't even go back as far, but I think 3 or 4 times more patents are drawn by universities than there were in the 1980s. So at least in a superficial sense, it works. But there's this question that sort of lies here, which is, do these patents actually promote the use of the inventions, right? That was the reason this act was promoted. The patents enrich a lot of universities. There's no doubt about that. So if you're, Stanford or Columbia or someone, then Bayh-Dole works because you're making a lot of money off of these patents. But that was not why it was passed. There's nothing in the bill that says we want to make Stanford rich. It's about trying to get these patents out into the community. And I want to use sort of the CRISPR as an example for asking some questions about this. And I would say that okay, so CRISPR, let's just stipulate for a second that Berkeley and MIT both have these patents that they get granted, and I think everybody thinks that that's sort of the future we're dealing with. You've got 2 institutions that don't own patents in this technology, and they've licensed them in a variety of different ways. We can look at the Broad as the primary example. They have a combination of exclusive and non-exclusive license for patents, depending on how you want to do it. I think that and the core of what I want to argue is, think about CRISPR for a second. If CRISPR had just been discovered in labs and they had just published it and nobody had patented it, I think everybody would be using it. And it's very, very hard to argue in the case of CRISPR, and I'll go into a little bit more detail, that these patents have stimulated any use in the technology, right? The second I heard about CRISPR, I was like, oh my God, I got to start using this stuff, right? And that's been true, I think, in the biotech world. Everybody wants to use the technology. It's so powerful, so easy to conceptualize, and so many possible uses that in cases like this, exclusive licensing, it only stifles use and innovation. I mean, we can argue about this, and I hope that many of these things prompt discussion, but that's certainly, I think, the case. A lot of the CRISPR patents are, a lot of the potential uses of CRISPR involve non-exclusive licensing, and I think in these cases, it's also very hard to argue that this accomplishes what Bayh-Dole was meant to accomplish. They serve no positive abuse in promoting use, right? I'm certainly not more likely to use something if I have to pay a licensing fee on it, but I also don't get any exclusive rights to use it, so it's not stimulating investment or anything like that. These non-exclusive licenses, which are extremely common, they're much more common than exclusive licenses in the way that academic patents get disposed of, are attacks. There's no other way to look at them. They're attacks on use by the industry, attacks that goes directly to universities, mostly pays administrator salaries. Those taxes are sort of almost perfect examples of something where you're introducing friction into a system, right? If you're a company and you have to pay a license to use CRISPR, you're giving up some potential to invest that money in other ideas. And I'm not going to get into too much detail about economic theory and things, but I think there's a lot of good reasons to believe that taxation at the point of use, instead of taxing the economic activity that something produced, is a really bad idea to do things. If we believe in these discoveries and we believe that they stimulate economic growth and new ideas and that these things are producing economic activity and things, then you definitely don't want to put this tax in up front, right? You want to say, well, we're going to give away this technology, and then after you've invented a $1 trillion drug and you make lots of money, hopefully you would actually pay taxes, although recognize that doesn't always happen, but that you tax the economic activity that this produces rather than the use of the technology. And I think that economic theorists on both the left and the right think that that's a much more sane way to use taxation to sort of encourage growth and not stifle it. Okay. Another thing, and this has come up in my own life. I mean, I'm an academic scientist, but I also am associated with various biotech companies and doing different things. And a lot of them are really scared of using CRISPR, right? They're scared of using CRISPR because there's uncertainty about the patents, and the uncertainty comes from the fact that the universities are fighting over who controls the licenses. And I think anybody who's involved in companies knows that intellectual property uncertainty. Whoops, fall off the stage here, is terrifying, right? The last thing you want to do is to develop something that's important for your company and then find out that you don't have the right license for it. And so I've seen many examples, both in the companies I'm associated with and other people, of people who could make use of CRISPR in very big and important ways, but are doing other things that are slower, more expensive, less efficient, because they're terrified of the uncertainty that comes from the current state of the intellectual property. Okay. So I think actually that from the perspective of the public, and again, people at Berkeley hate me probably for making this argument, but I think the patents that the Broad has and that Berkeley is fighting for are just a net loss to the public. I can see no positive benefit to the public that's come from allowing anybody in academia to patent their CRISPR discoveries. Okay? Now, maybe you can make a case that Berkeley is a public institution and needs more public money, and that some money that comes back to Berkeley is beneficial. But again, I think if you believe that, what you really should be doing is taxing the economic activity that CRISPR stimulates and putting more of that money back into the university, rather than allowing Berkeley actually to be a new form of tax collecting of use of technology. And this is something hopefully we can come up with in the discussion, is there any way, I think, in which the public would be worse off if the intellectual property around CRISPR were in the public domain? Okay, so that's easy, but CRISPR is kind of a unique case, right? It's a very high-profile invention. Everybody wants to use it. It clearly didn't need a lot of push to get people to use it. So there's not a huge amount of data on this, but I've been poring through what information there is about that's tried to characterize the types of patents that universities take, and especially in biology and really especially in genetics and genomics, a large fraction of the patents that are available out there that have been granted to universities or other academic institutions involve research methods. And while very few of those are likely to be as lucrative as CRISPR, I think the same logic applies. It's very hard to see how research method patents actually stimulate their use in the broader community. And again, I think you can make arguments about this, but I think that they're generally difficult to come up with. The better case for this is for things that involve actual products, right? And if you read the Bayh-Dole language, it was really intended to work for things that were not research methods, but more drugs, medical devices, things that people actually invented in a university and didn't have the means to take them out into the market. I think there are reasonable arguments that patents on such inventions do help them bring to the market. There are also, I think, reasonable arguments on the other side that they're still not necessary. That if you look back at Bayh-Dole when it was created, people made these arguments, but there really wasn't a lot of evidence to support them, and there still isn't a lot of evidence to support them. And there is actually some evidence, especially from countries in Europe that have different licensing rules on university inventions, that they do just as good a job, and in some cases better jobs, at taking technologies that come out of academia into products. So I think there's a real dearth of good empirical evidence supporting this principle. So you might be left with saying, okay, well, we don't have good empirical evidence. We sort of have to go with our gut here, and maybe our gut says this is a good thing. Except there's okay, actually. So one other issue is that many of the inventions where that you have to have exclusivity actually have intrinsically low commercial and in many cases low social value. That is, they aren't getting used, but that's because there's not a lot of interest in them. And this is certainly not always the case. But I think that the society doesn't benefit equally when any particular patent gets used. It's very asymmetric. Some patents are very beneficial to society, others aren't. They might be commercially beneficial to small people, the authors might want to develop them, but they don't serve a broader purpose. And I think the other thing that rarely gets talked about, and I think this is where I really want to get to in the end here, is there are huge downsides with Bayh-Dole that never, ever get discussed. They become a huge source of revenue for institutions, and for some institutions, and every institution thinks that they're just one paper away from $1 billion discovery that's going to pay for their football team and whatever else they waste their money on. And sorry, this should not say CRISPR in there. That got added. I'm cutting and pasting on the plane. So just as a result of this, and I think inspired by CRISPR, because there's a lot of money to be made for the university, quite against what was intended by Bayh-Dole, they ended up prioritizing the financial side of all these transactions instead of thinking about their wider use. And I think CRISPR is a good example. The exclusive licenses that are either granted or planned by the universities have no purpose other than to enrich the university. And they are not designed to maximize the use of the technology. So in this case, Bayh-Dole is actually created a system that runs counter to what it was intended to create. And this is actually a major part of the system. I mean, generally I don't like patents, but occasionally people in my lab have come up with sort of cute little ideas. And if they don't see billions of dollars or millions of dollars coming in from them, the university's not really interested in them. And I think that's not what Bayh-Dole was supposed to create. I see this from both the side of a researcher and from the side of companies that are trying to use university technology. Technology transfer offices from many universities are just a huge pain in the ass to work with. They're not acting in a way that's trying to maximize the use of the technology. They're trying to protect their own assets. And that patents with limited revenue potential, right, precisely the ones that are going to benefit potentially from exclusive licensing, receive little or no interest and priority from the universities because there's not a huge revenue potential. Also, and this is something that affects my life on a day-to-day basis. The cash-strapped universities, so I work at a cash-strapped university, prototypical cash-strapped university. They're terrified of this idea that somebody's going to invent something at the university, and they're going to have sent away a reagent to someone at some other university, and that other university is going to get the patent. So literally every exchange of a reagent, exchange of a method, is governed by this insane array of material transfer agreements. I can't get someone to send me a fly from Stanford, right? A fly line from Stanford to Berkeley without going through this, without having lawyers involved. And the system is insane. It's broken. It doesn't work. It's like the ultimate cover your ass kind of system. It induces insane amounts of friction into the academic world. Many cases in my own life, we have failed to get reagents because we couldn't sort out material transfer agreements between two academic institutions. It is totally nuts. And another consequence is we've reached the point now, and you've seen this in CRISPR at both the Broad and at Berkeley and other institutions. In hot fields like that, and in many others, there's literally pressure coming from the institution to delay the publication and communication of results until you can get patents filed. And this is going to get worse because of the initial decision in the Broad-Berkeley case, which focuses on actually showing that you can do something as opposed to anticipating a use. If we're in a world where you have to show something, it's just going to get terrible. And this is not universally held, but I hear this all the time. People in the biotech community think that university IP is now a net obstacle rather than a net plus to their ability to use and innovate on a lot of academic inventions. And again, not a universal opinion, not universally true for every technology or every field, but I hear this all the time in Silicon Valley. Okay. Also, it's not 1980 anymore. The world God, kind of pining for Ronald Reagan, but prior to Bayh-Dole, government-funded inventions belonged to the government, and the IP was actually rarely used. But we live in a different world now, right? We have so much more of an entrepreneurial culture, and especially around science and technology. We have this huge amount of venture capital. I can't walk down the street in Silicon Valley without someone trying to stuff a few $1 million in my pocket to do something, start a social networking site for scientists or something. But there's a lot of money, and I think this idea that there's not a lot of interest in investing in academic discoveries is just flawed. So I'm just going to finish with this. I'd like to discuss this idea that I think all government-funded research should just be in the public domain. It's simple. I think it would promote the goals of Bayh-Dole much more effectively than the system we have today. I also think I'm not going to talk about publishing, but I think the same thing that holds true for patents should apply for copyright. One can imagine a bill, and I'm sort of starting to work on such a thing, that would be easy. I kind of like using taxpayer access. Everybody likes taxpayers. Taxpayer access to scientific knowledge that would do two simple things. Just prohibit the patenting by nonprofit research organizations that receive significant government funding of inventions that came from that funding. And another thing I've long liked, to just extend the prohibition on copyrights that currently apply to works that are done by government employees to any work funded by the US government. And this would include papers as well as software and other things that are covered by copyright, generally not by inventions. As you might say, this is, as a scientist, I might not have much of an opportunity to make something like this happen, but I'll just finish by saying, perhaps I'll have an actual opportunity to introduce that bill. So anyway, thanks a lot, and